Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is the second lecture of the course, and this lecture will be focusing on talking about the relationship between biology and gender. As we have seen in the last lecture, that is the introductory lecture, we talked about the building blocks of sociology, because this course is going to adopt a sociological perspective to understand gender in society. So we talked about some of the building blocks of sociology. We talked about some of the concepts, some of the sociological concepts that we shall be using in the course, particularly talking about how we understand categories, how we understand stereotypes and so on. So we clarified a few concepts in this regard, and we talked about some of the definitions of gender that have surfaced over the decades. So we have seen that one of the earliest definitions of gender were proposed based on the biological condition of the body, and later on this was actually broadened to understand gender as a process at an institutional scale, and gender as proposed as being fluid, not static. So in this lecture, what we will focus on is to understand a conceptual clarification between what we understand to be the biological condition of the body, in other words what we call the sex of the body, and then how we understand gender with respect to that. Oftentimes what happens is the terms biological sex and gender get confused, and people and agencies and government and so on tend to use the two terms interchangeably. But let us go through understanding, are these two terms similar? Are these two terms different? Are they identical to each other? So what is the relationship between these two terms? So we start by a couple of key questions here. That the first question we ask is, are there innate differences between males and females in society, or do we assume that there are such differences? In other words, the biological conditions that people are born with, is that defining gender differences for people in society, or do we start with an assumption that there are these differences and much of our actions, much of our policies, much of our expressions in societies are actually guided by these assumed differences? So that's the first question we need to ask. The second question we need to ask is, when we talk about key issues in society, such as we talk about education, we loosely refer to such issues as, girls' education versus boys' education. So we are constantly using these terms to differentiate between certain things, certain practices, certain processes in society. And so are these differences truly biological? So when we talk about a girl's education, or when we talk about a boy's education, is this driven by biology only, or are there any other factors at play that define these differences for us in society? So are they supposedly based on biological differences perceived as a difference? So the question here is to understand whether these differences actually exist objectively in reality in society, or are these differences perceived as differences? Are these differences assumed as differences in society, and much of our actions are actually guided by these assumed differences? So let's look at understanding the starting point to differentiate between biological sex and gender. So when we look at culture, so culture is a concept we talked about last lecture, that culture has an evolutionary basis, and this cultural evolutionary basis gives us some of the similarities and some of the points of departure we have with other primates in society or in the environment. So we see that there are certain things that we share with other primates, which is we learn from experience, we change behavior as a result, we have tools for doing certain activities in society, and we all believe in a process of hunting and gathering. So these are some of the similarities we have with primates, but there are certain points of departure that human beings have from other primates. And the first point is that cooperation and sharing are much more developed among humans. And then humans maximize their reproductive success throughout the year. That is, unlike primates, human beings do not have a particular mating season. And the third point of departure is that humans have exogamy and kinship systems. So these are carefully crafted systems of lineage, of kinship, of family that build a society that is one of the most important building blocks of society. And that is one of the points of departure from the primates. So the reason we need to understand this is to identify that the biological condition of the body is present for both primates and human beings in society. However, the idea of gender is exclusively a social construct that is based on human behavior, human expression in society, and that is not really found in the primates. So this is one of the first starting points to understand where biological condition of the body actually departs from the understanding of gender. So we looked at a couple of definitions last class, and we looked at the one of the earlier definitions where gender is the psychological, social and cultural aspects of maleness and femaleness, and we identified that while this was a very good start to identify what gender can be all about, this definition can be narrow in its focus because of its focus on the biological condition of maleness and femaleness. And over the years we have seen that research have pointed out that gender has become a social system, a social institution, and it has become a system of social practices that creates distinction and organizes relations of inequality on the basis of these distinctions, which was forwarded by Ridgway and Smith-Lovin in 1999. So with that in regard, what requires attention to is to understand personalities, minds, bodies, and all characteristics that comprise people. So in other words, it is not just biology that determines the gender of a person or gender as an institution, but we need to pay more attention to holistic model that focuses beyond biology, takes into consideration biology, but focuses beyond biology also, and looks at personalities, minds, and other characteristics that actually define people in society. And with that, we also bring in an understanding of how we define masculinity and femininity. So masculinity and femininity are two terms often used as descriptors for gender expressions, and oftentimes what happens is the idea of masculinity gets equated with male and man, and femininity gets equated with female and woman. But it can be problematic to equate the terms all the time, and we will see why. So what happens is, we talked about categories last class, and as you have probably noticed by now, that the terms biological sex and gender are often used interchangeably, but conceptually they are actually two different things. So we see that in usual conversation, what happens is people often refer to men and women as the opposite sex. So we loosely use these descriptions that men and women are opposite to each other, and this means that men and women would subscribe to completely different categories. So remember the way we understood categories, how people group up according to similarities or do not group up because they do not find similarity with certain groups. So the way we build categories, so these categories are assumed to be similar within themselves, and so men and women have emerged to be as the opposite sex category in popular conversation. So the question is, are women and men completely opposite to each other? Because we see that biologically speaking, the males and females, they share many characteristics. For example, both have 23 pairs of chromosomes and both are warm blooded, but they do differ in their bodily constitutions. So the distinction made on characteristics including hormonal production is what is termed as the sex of the body, the biological condition of the body. So with that in respect, the claim that the anatomical condition, the biological condition, marks a distinction between two physically, genetically discrete categories of people is called. So a third idea that we need to clarify here is the idea of the biological sex assignment. And the concept of sex assignment is the process that at birth or even prenatally, if applicable, people actually identify a baby by virtue of it being a male or a female, and assign the baby to a particular biological category. So the biological sex assignment is a process by which social meanings are attached to biological condition of the body. So this is an important way to understand the biological condition of the body and how and why it helps or actually do not help for us to understand gender in society. So now we have a problem. The problem is, we talk about men and women as males and females, as two different categories, but then not all the time people can fit in neatly in either of these two boxes. So we have a condition called biologically intersexed. So now we have a problem. If we accept the idea that human beings are born as males or females and they neatly fit into either of the two boxes of male and female, like you see on survey forms, or where you have to tick a box whether you are a male or a female. And the problem is, when you do not identify with either of the two boxes, and this is a condition that that happens biologically, that happens naturally, and this is called biologically intersexed people. So we encounter a problem with categories in this respect. So if we take a blueprint, as you can see on the slide, if we take a blueprint of females being the XX and the male being the XY, then what about other combinations, such as something that is not XS or something that is not XY? So we need as a society to develop a framework, a theoretical framework, an analytical framework to understand that we have a problem with neat categories, and what do we do when these categories do not hold true all the time. So this is the idea of the intersex people, and it is often seen that they may have characteristic features of both males and females, and they're often described by the term hermaphrodites. So it is estimated that on an average 17 people in every 1,000 people fall into this sexually ambiguous category. So we are not able as a society to understand, do they fit into one box or do they not fit into one box. So in a way these categories are challenged. In a way it posits a new challenge for society to rethink these categories and to actually redefine these categories. Sometimes what happens is, to overcome these problems, if it is identified at birth, babies are actually submitted for medical surgeries so that it is easier to fit them into one of these two categories. So if you look up the history of all of this, you will encounter a person called John Money, who was a psychologist in the 1950s. So what he did with his colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, that they used to study sexually ambiguous patients. So they worked with children and some adults born with unusually combinations of biological markers or sexual ambiguity, and they actually did psychological analysis, psychological tests to understand that category of people. So what John Money came up with is an idea of a gender gate. So a gender gate, he proposed, is that up to the age of 2 years, they started, a person who is a baby who is born as a sexually ambiguous baby or an intersex baby has a gender gate of a period of time within which the ambiguity can be corrected, as Money proposed, is it can be corrected and it can be through medical surgeries and can be fitted neatly into either of the two established categories. And there is a very significant study in this regard where it is actually called the John Joan case, where a set of identical twins was actually studied by John Money, and biologically both were born as boys, and one of whom Money proposed could be raised a girl. So I propose that if you are interested to know more about this study, there are academic resources where you can go and read up what happened with the John Joan case. But the point here is that you can actually follow this New York Times link to read up what happened. So the point here is to clarify that the concepts, the categories that we make in society can be problematic, can be challenging, and therefore we need to rethink the ways we categorize people in the way that we usually do. So going to the history of biological sex and the human body, we see that prior to the 18th century, the idea of masculinity and femininity were thought to be expressions of one human body. So what used to happen is, people used to think that there is only one version of the human body, and masculinity and femininity are expressions of the same human body. So we see a very significant study by Thomas Lacker proposed in 1990, where Lacker actually brought the one sex and the two sex model. So he talks, so Lacker talks about that there existed, I'm talking about pre-18th century, there existed only the one sex model which was assumed to be the male model, and any deviation from that male model would be studied with respect to that one sex model. Later on, this became the two sex model, which emphasizes that male and female are different and often opposite bodies. So one interesting study, one area of study in this respect, as studied in Holmes 2009, is how human skeletons were actually labeled. So we see that before the mid 18th century, scientific drawings of skeletons actually tended just to be labeled as humans, but from late that century of the 18th century, the drawings began to be made of female skeletons, emphasizing differences rather than similarities. So you see that even the biological condition of the body, something that we think is probably static, the idea, the studies around that has shifted over time and through space. So this also brings us to understanding that the biological sex of the body, the condition of the body, is interpretive. It is contingent on certain factors, and it has to be contextualized. It differs across time, space, and cultures, and the way which we define the markers of biological sex categories, they shift over time. So what counts as markers of sex categories depends heavily on cultural circumstances, and they vary widely across time, space, and social groups. So we see that over time, the idea of the biological condition of the body, which is supposed to be static, which is supposed to be not changing, has actually posed as something that is interpretive also, that it is contextualized in a particular time and space for a particular social group, and unless we understand the cultural factors, the cultural parameters that actually influence the biological markers that we assign to these categories, it becomes difficult and often problematic or misleading to understand them as categories. So here we see that there have been research which have tried to understand this constant transition of this understanding. So here we have a definition from Hoenge and Hoenge that we are the products of both our biologies and our past and present environments. Simultaneously and inseparably, we are bodies as well as minds at one and the same time. So here we see an attempt to actually understanding biology beyond the condition of the body, understanding biology in a socio-historical context within the environment, and understanding bodies sociologically, psychologically in a holistic manner. So we see that from this definition that biology and society interact to shape human behavior. So when we talk about a masculine behavior or a male behavior, it is as much society as much biology that is actually informing this interaction of that behavior. So we also see that the differences between categories of women and men, how we make these categories, are assumed to be greater than the difference among or within these categories. So this is a discussion we had last lecture also, that when we define these categories, we put limits on these categories, we assume that whoever or whatever is inside that category are all similar to each other. So the difference between two categories, say category A and category B, is supposedly more, supposedly greater than the difference that may exist within category A or within category B. So, much of these earlier studies were actually focused on understanding the difference between categories, and probably that is one of the reasons that male or female or men and women are posited as opposite categories, because the difference between the categories were studied with more significance than the differences within each category. So, this also brings to the front a question that the degree to which the biological conditions are seen to be socially constructed. So, the question is that a person is born male or female is the biological condition of the body, but there is some level of social construction that goes on, particularly with regard to understanding the biological markers of what makes a male or what defines a female. And so, it is important for us to understand the degree to which the biological condition of the human body are seen to be socially constructed. And does biology impose constraints or limits on gender? So, does the fact that a person is born male or a person is born female impose a constraint or put a limit to the gender of the person? That is, to be born as a male, does it translate automatically to that person growing up as a man? Or to be born a female, does it automatically translate to that person growing up into a woman? So, going back to the idea of biological dimorphism, we see a definition proposed by Kessler and McKenna in 1978 that scientists construct dimorphism where there is continuity. Biological, psychological, social differences do not lead to our seeing two genders. Our seeing of two genders leads to the discovery of biological, psychological and social differences. So, what these scholars are doing here is to understand what goes on, or how do we actually decide that we have something called a biological dimorphism in society. So, what they are proposing is that scientists construct dimorphism only when there is a continuity, and in this case the biological and the psychological and sociological differences do not lead to seeing two genders. Instead, our seeing two genders leads to the discovery of biological, psychological and social differences. So, this relates to the some of the assumptions that we talked about at the start of this lecture, that do these differences actually exist, or do we assume that these differences actually exist, and much of our behavior and expressions actually take part after that. So, we again encounter two questions in this regard. The first question being the sociological understanding of what men and women are or should be, and then perceive biological differences. So, is it that we first understand what a man should be or a woman should be, and then we perceive the biological differences of maleness and femaleness? And the second question is that a belief that there exists two objectively identifiable and hence real biological categories. So, what is it that makes us as societies, as a society, believe that there exists two objectively identifiable biological categories of male and female? Because unless we understand what makes us assume or what makes us believe that only these two categories and only these two categories exist, it becomes problematic, it becomes challenging for us as society to function and to not account for people who do not neatly fit into these either of these two categories. So having said that, I want to walk you through a set of continuums now, and the continuum that we just saw in the previous slide of Kessner and McKenna, that they're talking about the dimorphism existing only when there is a continuity. So the first continuum that we can consider here is from having male on one end and having female on the other end, if we want to look at it as a continuum, and we have the intersex somewhere in between, which is the biological condition of the body driven by anatomy, chromosomes, hormones. So this is one way of looking at the continuum. The second way of looking at that continuum is having man on one end, having woman on the other end, and having a third gender in the middle, and which is what we call the gender identity, which is the psychological sense of the self. So this is the second understanding of a continuum. The third continuum that we see here is having masculine on one end and feminine on the other, and androgynous in the middle, and this is what we usually term as the gender expression or the communication of gender. And the fourth continuum in this respect, we have what we understand to be the sexual orientation of a person based on affinity. So we have attracted to women on one hand and attracted to men on the other, and then we have ideas of bisexual, asexual in the middle. Now these are four possible ways of looking at how the biological condition of the body and gender actually can be related to each other. Now there can be a problem, because oftentimes what we do as society is we try to equate any one side of all the four continuums. For example, oftentimes if we take the left hand side of all the four continuums, we think and we probably believe that if a person is born male, the person will grow up into a man, the person will be masculine, and the person will be attracted to women. So we kind of equate the four parts, the four left hand side, and likewise on the right hand side, if we try to equate that a person is born female and grows up, is expected to grow up as a woman, is expected to be feminine, and is expected to be attracted to men. Now this is what we understand to be the norm in society. So all societies function based on certain norms, certain belief systems, and in most given societies, equating either of the two extremes of the four continuums would be the norm, would be common sense, would be acceptable in society. But it doesn't mean that this equation would be true all the time in all the societies, irrespective of time and space. So what happens, for example, hypothetically, if a person is born male, probably grows up into a man, but identifies more with the feminine ways of expression. So I'm crossing one, if you can see on the continuum on the slide. So now you see that while this is the norm to equate either of the two sides of the four continuums, that a person born male expected to grow up into a man, expected to be masculine, and expected to be attracted to women, and likewise on the right hand side you see a person who is born female, expected to grow up as a woman, and expected to be feminine and expected to be attracted to men. So this is how we understand the norms of a society, how the norms of a society actually are built. And this is probably true for all societies or most societies across time and space. However, this is not the only way of building norms around gender. For example, we know and we have numerous examples in society across space and time, historically and in contemporary times, that for example, in hypothetical situations, if a person is born a male and probably grows up into a social understanding of a man, but it identifies more with the feminine way of gender expression, as you can see on the screen, on the continuum, that here what we see, that person born male grows up into a man but identifies more with the feminine gender expression and may be attracted to men. So we see a continuum crossing here. So we see that we are equating, so the first two continuums hold normal, the so called normal way, but the after the second continuum, it tends to get moving away from the normal. So but then the point here is that such cases, such examples do exist in society, and so we need to be mindful, we need to be critically aware of understanding these social processes, these social expressions, that what happens when certain characteristic features are not normative, not normal according to societal standards. So this is one of the problems, one of the limitations, that if we continue to equate the biological condition of the body with the understanding of gender, then we encounter these strict categories where we cannot fit in people neatly all the time, and which means that we are leaving out an important part of society unresearched, not studied, and therefore we are not really putting forward a holistic model of understanding the society. So we see that the idea of gender and biological sex are they can be, and they probably are, social constructs. So in most societies we are committed to the idea of people being either male or female. So we have this understanding from a priori that people are either male or female, and we are kind of committed to these ideas. The presence and awareness about intersex people help us see that biological categories are not dichotomous. So this is a classic example that shows us that if we have dichotomous categories, if we have neat categories, it is problematic to fit in all the people all the time neatly into all of these two categories. And gender is a social construction of femininity and masculinity, which is the differences in temperament and behavior we expect beyond anatomical differences. So this is where gender differs from the biological condition or the anatomical differences, is that it is a social construction of how we understand masculinity, how we understand femininity, and the differences in temperament and behavior that we expect, that goes beyond the anatomical differences. So again, I go back to the two definitions for you to revisit and now reconsider again. Because you have had this journey through a part of this lecture to make this distinction between the biological differences and gender as a social construct. So when we say that you become a man or you become a woman, all of that takes us, moves us away from the biological understanding of the body to a space, to an concept, to an idea that is socially constructed, that is not given a priori, that is something that is fluid in society, that gets constructed all the time, reconstructed, deconstructed, challenged all the time. So it's kind of very fluid. And with that, we have the first concept here, the concept of gender identity, which is your personal sense of self as a man or a boy or a woman or a girl. So it is the personal sense, as you can see from the definition, that gender identity is the personal sense of the self as to who you are, who you identify with. The next concept in this regard is gender role, which is everything you feel, think, say and do that shows to yourself and others that you are a man or a woman. So it is something that is that you are expressing, something that you are doing, something that you are feeling or thinking or saying, that is you are doing it to show or to actually say that you are a man or a woman. And finally, there is something called the gender role stereotype, which is, if you recall the definition of stereotypes that we talked about last lecture, that the ways in which oversimplified rigid beliefs that all members of a biological sex category have distinct behavioral, psychological, emotional characteristics. So gender role stereotypes are these oversimplified belief systems that we have, that we assign or that we have about about members of a particular category. For example, a category of women or category of men, and we have this rigid beliefs that they have certain distinct behavioral characteristics or emotional or psychological characteristics, and therefore if they deviate from those characteristics, then it becomes problematic in society, because society has already established its norms and beliefs in this regard. So this is what exactly gives rise to gender role stereotypes, to have that condition of a single story. Remember the definition of stereotype, that there is a danger with a single story, and stereotypes are often the one story, the single story that is oversimplified and unchallenged. So here we see that most societies have defined masculine and feminine behavior as polar opposites, and we often have certain characteristic features that we equate with men and with males and females. So with males, we often identify loud, aggressive, brave behavior, and with females we often identify quiet, passive, timid behavior. And there has been studies, has been research where people have, where it was actually studied to understand or measure how these gender role perceptions actually pan out. So we have the BSRI, or the BEM Sex Role Inventory, which was developed by Sandra Bem in 1970, to measure the gender role perceptions as it categorizes people. And so if you can see here that the BSRI has a set of traits. So it is a test that a person can take, and it has a set of traits that so it has having mostly masculine traits, having mostly feminine traits, having a pretty even mix of each, which is the androgynous category, and not fitting these stereotypes, which is undifferentiated. So it's a psychometric test, and I think it's available online if you're interested to go and take a look. So it has been one of the first ways of looking at how can we actually understand or measure the gender role perception of people. So, with that, let's now look at briefly about the biological factors in gender differences that we can think of, and starting with the factor of hormones. So, we see that females have small amount of the male hormone testosterone, and males have small amounts of female hormones like progesterone and estrogen. So, these are hormones that can be categorized into male and female, and we see that certain people, females, they have small amount of testosterone, and males tend to have small amounts of the female hormones. So, studies have shown that in childhood the differences are quite small, but they increase markedly in adolescents and adults. And there are two surges of hormones as indicated by these studies, prenatally or during adolescence. So, this is one biological factor, hormones, that have defined and gone to a great extent to educate us, to make us understand how we as a society actually attach values to the biological factors to define gender. And these studies have also shown that girls who have received testosterone or testosterone like hormones, they tend to have masculinized behavior. So, masculinized behavior would include, behaving tomboyish, or having vigorous athletic activities, and having more male type achievement pattern or male type attitudes in society. So, one classic area of study in this regard is the idea of biological sex gender in sports, and there have been a lot of discussions that have been going on in recent times, particularly with regard to two athletes, as you can see on the slide. Dudhi Chand from India, and then we have Caster Semenya from South Africa, and both of them have been under both of them have been in focus with regard to their testosterone levels. So, if you recall from the previous slide, we said that females tend to have low levels of this testosterone hormone, which is the male hormone, and both these athletes have they show a very high what is reported as the unusually high levels of testosterone, and therefore both of them have been subject to numerous gender tests which have been controversial, and I encourage you to take a look at the socio cultural histories that actually went on behind the cases of Dudhi Chand for India and then Caster Semenya in South Africa. So, what happened in both the cases is the board actually asked them to take a gender test, and if they do not qualify that gender test, then they are probably not qualified, not eligible to be part of the category, the sport that they wanted to participate in. So, I'm using it here as a case to show that these are concepts, these are beliefs that make us as a society, and they get expressed in society all the time, and when these are not fitted neatly into either of the two boxes, then their society sees them as problem to the extent such as the cases that we see here on the screen. So, I encourage you, you would be able to see some of the links here to the news article, and there is a documentary on Caster Semenya which is actually called Too Fast to Be a Woman, and I encourage you to go take a look at these news articles, these documentaries, which will give you a further exposure to understand that what happens when the biological condition of the body is equated with gender in society and the problems that it can bring forth. So, to sum up, we see that the journey from the biological sex or the biological condition of the body to gender has traveled quite a distance in research and scholarship. So, pre 1970s, we see that the biological differences between the two sexes of male and female were the prevalent ways of doing research, rather than explaining how men and women relate to each other within the family or in society. So, what happened is, because biological differences can be static, or they are more static than gender. Gender is the fluid category. So, in comparison to that, they proposed static theories that is engaging in the understanding the differences, the biological differences between male and female, and not really how people relate to each other in a society. The 1970s actually saw, with the second wave of feminism, that it saw there was a lot of change in the household dynamics, primarily in the West, in the US, and gender around that time emerged as a social construct. So, if you recall from the last lecture, that it was around this time that more and more research were being focused on women as research subjects. More attention was being given to household dynamics, to household work, household labor, and then all of that actually summed up to the emergence of a concept of gender as a social construct, as something that as a society we we do and change in society. The 1980s actually saw that the demarcation between males and females was not just within the broader structures, but how these categories of people relate to each other. So, the 1980s actually pushed for an extension of this dialogue, that to look beyond the male and female categories and how people actually look at relate to each other in society. And then this time also saw that a whole host of research which looked at gender not as a property of an individual, but as an emergent feature of social situations. So, gender is therefore also about power relations. So, the emergent ways of understanding gender since the 1980s have been to look at gender also as important power relations in society, and not just a static property of an individual. So, just to sum up, that the biological condition of the body differs from gender in the way that gender is a cultural understanding, gender is a social construct, and the biological condition is usually differentiated on the anatomical conditions of the body, on the basis of genitalia, and gender on the other hand is these categories differentiated on the basis of cultural meanings that are attached. So, we have this shared understanding, shared cultural understanding, which can be universal or they can be socially culturally specific, that we have as part of gender. And biological conditions are kind of given, they are kind of static in society, and the idea of gender is negotiated almost every day, and it evolves as a concept every day. So, the biological differences point out stereotypes about women and men in society, which means that if we only stick to the biological differences as the only understanding of gender in society, the danger is that we are only going to produce certain stereotypes about women and men in society, and the dialogue will not move further than that. And these assumed differences often get translated to imbalances of power. As we have seen, the gender can be a power relation between people. So with that, I want to conclude today's lecture, but I want to leave you with a couple of assignments. And the first assignment, as you can see on the screen, is that we have seen that biological sex and gender are important central concepts in social sciences, and they often get used as synonymous by people, governments, and some researchers. So I'm asking you, should they be synonymous, or are they really different concepts that should be kept separate and understood as signifying different social categories or lines that divide? So what I want you to do before the next lecture is that to come up with your definitions for the biological sex and gender. You define each separately. What do you understand by the biological sex, and what do you understand by gender? And in your own mind, do you see that these two concepts of biological sex and gender as more similar or as more different? So what is your take on these two concepts? And identify yourself according to your biological sex and gender, following the definitions that you have cited above in the first question. So you take a moment to reflect and see, how do people around you, family, friends, colleagues, peers, view your sex and gender as, and why do you think they categorize you as such? So it is a reflective question that you first understand the difference between sex and gender, and then you see how you are looked at around by the people around you. The second assignment entails that if you have a sibling, whether of the same sex or of the opposite sex, recall some of the differences in behavior that you may have, or expectations, if any, that your parents or family had from the both of you. So if you see that there are differences in expectations or behavior, whether your sibling and you belong to the same biological sex, or you belong to the opposite biological sex. And alternatively, if you are a parent watching this lecture, think about the decisions that you take, or the decisions that guide you with regard to your daughters and sons expectations and behavior in society. So do these decisions differ for you for daughters and sons, and does biology have a role to play? So I want you to reflect on, does it have a biological reasoning behind how and why you decide to do or guide your sons or daughters in a particular way? If yes, or if no, why? So these are the two reflective assignments I want to leave you with. If you are interested for further readings, please take a look at Anne Foster Sterling's Sex, Gender, Biology in a Social World, and Amy Wharton's Sociology of Gender, an Introduction to Theory and Research. And in the next lecture, we will continue talking about gender as a social construction, and we will see what are the ways that gender actually manifests itself in society as a social construct. Thank you.